Let's now turn our attention to the Asian region and have a look at the biggest economy in Asia to begin with, which is, of course, China. China reported a 9.3% decline in real GDP in the first quarter compared with the first quarter of 2019. And as you can see from the left-hand chart, that represented the biggest decline year on year in Chinese economic activity since the famine, which followed Mao Zedong's so-called Great Leap Forward in the early 1960s. That was, of course, the period that gained Mao the dubious title of being responsible for more deaths than Hitler and Stalin combined, although he didn't cause them in quite the same way as Hitler and Stalin did. Chinese economic activity rebounded very sharply in the June quarter, up 11.5% from what it had been in the first quarter of 2020. And if we look at more partial and up-to-date indicators, we can see confirmation that the production side of the Chinese economy, if I can call it that, rebounded quite strongly in the second quarter of the year. Not quite to pre-pandemic levels, but nonetheless well above the low point seen in March when the infections were at their most serious in China. China's exports have held up reasonably well. They've been a bit soft in the last couple of months, but haven't declined as much as they did, for example, during the global financial crisis. But while the production side of the Chinese economy might have rebounded strongly, when we look at the demand side, and in particular at household spending or the movement of people, the recovery there, though there's been one, has been much more tepid or slow than the recovery in production has been. It's also interesting that there hasn't really been much of an upturn in residential construction investment or in property prices, as there usually has been following major bouts of monetary and fiscal policy stimulus in China in recent cycles, such as immediately after the financial crisis of 12 years ago, or after the mini financial crisis that China had on its own between late 2014 and the middle of 2016. Inflation, which rose quite sharply last year, largely as a result of a very significant leap in pork prices, as a result of the authorities needing to slaughter a lot of pigs to prevent the spread of a disease among pigs to humans. That's eased off quite a lot. And in fact, non-food inflation has fallen almost to zero in China in the last couple of months. And at the producer level, that is goods coming out of factories and the like, prices have actually been falling for most of the last couple of years. It is notable, as I mentioned before when discussing the world economy, that China seems to be doing more by way of fiscal policy than it did during the global financial crisis, although those fiscal policy measures seem to be taking a somewhat different form from what they did during the global financial crisis. There appears to be less by way of commodity-intensive infrastructure spending than there was back then, and more support for income of households and relieving businesses costs that they still have to incur during a period when they're not making as much by way of sales revenue as they would have been if conditions were more normal. The Chinese government is also doing a fair amount of direct lending to small to medium enterprises, which might otherwise be in danger of going bankrupt. What's also notable is that the People's Bank of China, the central bank, has been more cautious about providing monetary policy stimulus than it was in 2008-9 or again in 2015-16. Interest rates have fallen, to be sure, but not as dramatically as in major advanced economies. And if you look at the bottom chart in the middle column there, you can see that credit growth, though it has picked up a little bit, hasn't picked up nearly as sharply as it did in 2009 or again in 2015. That may well be because the People's Bank of China hasn't put to one side the concerns that have been top of its list about financial stability in the past 3 or 4 years. People's Bank of China and other regulators became very concerned about the rapid growth of shadow banks, that is, non-bank financial institutions, and the so-called wealth management products that banks and shadow banks were offering to ordinary households during the period between about 2013 and 2017. They've clamped down on that quite significantly. Of course, as many observers have noted, China does have an awful lot of debt for an emerging economy. In some ways, it has as much debt as almost all advanced economies, if you were to take out Japan in particular, which has a very high level of debt. It's certainly true that by advanced economy standards, China's household debt isn't particularly large, nor is its government debt. But China has an awful lot of corporate debt, as you can see, reaching almost 150% of GDP. A good deal of that is, of course, owed by state-owned enterprises to state-owned banks. And one perspective is that that simply represents opposing items on the same ultimate parent company balance sheet, that is, that of the People's Republic of China. And if a large proportion of those debts were to go bad, as many of them almost certainly are, if they were accounted for using accounting standards that are prevalent in Western countries, then the problem that would cause for the state-owned banks could be resolved by drawing down on the foreign exchange reserves of the People's Bank of China, which of course the Chinese authorities have done twice before, in 1999 during Zhu Rongji's reforms to state-owned enterprises, and then again in the middle years of the past decade, ahead of the listing of the 5 biggest Chinese banks on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange and the sale of minority interests in them to a range of American or European financial institutions. That, of course, led to the establishment of the so-called Central Huijin Corporation, which in turn became one of the core elements of the China Investment Corporation, China's sovereign wealth fund, when it was established in 2011 or 2012. Of course, nowadays, with the level of debt being much higher than it was in either of those two episodes, and with the People's Bank of China having run down its reserves by a quarter, defending the renminbi exchange rate in 2014 through 2016, it's a moot question as to whether the PBOC's reserves would be enough fully to recapitalize the banks were that to be necessary. But one of the things that's clearly close to uppermost in the PBOC's mind is to avoid adding further to that problem by having the sort of burst of credit provision that we saw on those 2 earlier occasions in 2008-9 and afterwards, and again in 2014 through 2017. One other problem that the Chinese authorities have to contend with is that the banking system itself isn't nearly as robust on the liability side of its balance sheet as it traditionally was. One of the great strengths which the Chinese banking system exhibited during the Asian financial crisis of now more than 20 years ago was that because its lending books were overwhelmingly financed by customer deposits, which are typically much less fleeting than wholesale funding. The Chinese banks didn't experience any of the difficulties that banks in Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, and the Philippines did at the height of that crisis. But particularly since 2014, when major banks increasingly began funding their loan growth, not from customer deposits, but from borrowings in the wholesale money markets and in the bond markets, that pillar of strength in the Chinese banking system has disappeared. And now deposits account for less than 100% of the loans of the Chinese banking system. In that sense, the Chinese banking system has begun to take on some of the characteristics of American and European banks leading up to the financial crisis of 2008-9, which in some ways can be depicted as an electronic wholesale run on banks, rather than a retail run of the sort that's sometimes been featured in films and has occurred in banking crises in years gone by. It's obviously not quite as bad as it was for the European banks and banks like Lehman Brothers in the United States, but nonetheless, that's a trend that the Chinese authorities would be keen not to see continue. The Chinese have been managing the renminbi's exchange rate rather more flexibly in recent years than they had before 2015. Instead of being closely pegged to the US dollar, it's now managed against a trade-weighted index run by the China Foreign Exchange Trading System. That's why it's sometimes known as the CFETS index. And of late, the renminbi has been appreciating mainly because of weakness in the US dollar rather than because of any significant independent strength of the renminbi. But a longer term concern, which is shown by this chart, is the marked divergence since 2014 between the PBOC's foreign exchange reserves and the rate of growth of domestic credit. For a country running a managed exchange rate regime, it's normally a requirement that the amount of money circulating in the economy, the amount of credit that's provided by the economy's banking system, moves more or less in line with the supply of foreign exchange reserves. In a currency board system like the one Hong Kong has had since 1983, there's actually a requirement that every Hong Kong dollar on issue be backed by foreign currency reserves, or in Hong Kong's case, by funds made available through the Land Fund. And that's historically been a rule that the People's Bank of China has been guided by during the period when its exchange rate was pegged to the US dollar. But since 2014-15, when, as I mentioned before, the PBOC lost about $1 trillion, or almost a quarter of its reserves, putting a floor under the renminbi, credit growth has continued to climb quite significantly. The Chinese have been able to box this in by imposing an extremely strict capital controls regime. And of course, they have various means of enforcing that aren't always available to countries with different political systems to China's, and less of an appetite for the sort of mass surveillance that China now goes in for. If there were, however, to be, for some reason, at some point in the future, a tsunami of capital outflows, it's hard to see that happening other than in circumstances of considerable political instability in China, and that doesn't look likely anytime soon. But were at some point in the perhaps more distant future there to be a significant outflow of capital from China, the renminbi would almost certainly fall very sharply. And that's obviously a risk that people need to keep an eye on if they do have an exposure to renminbi denominated assets. But let me emphasize, that's not something that's going to happen anytime soon, because China's capital controls have been enforced very strictly and so far have held pretty fast. Just moving slightly away from the economic sphere for a moment, but nonetheless something that's important in the context of thinking about China. China does seem to have become more belligerent in its dealings with nearly all of its neighbours and other countries in the region in the last year or so. If you look at this map, you can see that China has been busily putting its footprint on a string of islands in the broader Indo-Pacific, as the Americans like to call it, not just in the South China Sea, where that's received a good deal of attention in the world's media, but also in the Solomon Islands, where they've acquired a 75-year lease on a base that was used by the Americans during World War II, and also an island in the Maldives, which they acquired a lease of in 2016 and have since been expanding it in the same way that they've expanded some islands in the South China Sea that's got more attention. They've also been confronting Vietnamese fishing boats and Malaysian-owned oil rigs in different parts of the South China Sea. As people will be well aware, they have imposed new national security laws on Hong Kong, effective at the beginning of this month, and they've started to arrest people in the past week who've been found or alleged to be in breach of those laws. There's been a series of military confrontations with Indian troops along their 2,000-mile border in 4 or 5 different locations that represent the fingers of of the palm that is Tibet, in the language of former CCP chairman Mao Zedong. And of course, it was well noted that at last month's National People's Congress, the word peaceful was removed for the first time in 40 years from the usual statement about the desirability and inevitability, as the CCP sees it, of reunification with Taiwan, which China regards as a renegade province. And of course, sitting down here in Australia, we've seen a series of statements from Chinese officials, or in the Global Times, that sometimes serves as a mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party, threatening retaliation against Australia's exports of wine and beef, actually carrying out significant tariff measures against imports of barley from China, and telling Chinese students and tourists not to come to Australia because it's a dangerous country. Now, of course, Chinese students and tourists can't come to Australia at the moment because our government won't let them in, but clearly there's a suggestion there that if and when that changes, the Chinese government will be actively discouraging Chinese people from visiting Australia. And it seems to be in part because of the call Australia's foreign minister made earlier this year for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, although in the end, that resolution at the UN was supported by China itself, as well as Europe and the United States. China also has resented Australia's actions in barring Huawei from participating in the construction of telecommunications infrastructure. Some of the other restrictions that Australia has imposed on foreign investment, that, although not explicitly directed at China, have been seen in that light. And some other measures that the Australian government has taken to reduce what the Australian government sees as interference in Australia's internal political affairs by agents acting on behalf of the Chinese government and the Communist Party's United Work Front. Of course, from the Chinese perspective, and it's important to give that equal weight, they would say they're not doing anything in the Indo-Pacific that the United States hasn't been doing for more than 70 years. The United States has a string of military bases and naval facilities around the Pacific, which China perhaps understandably feels threatened by. And if they wanted to, though they haven't done so far, the Chinese could also make the point that they're not doing anything in the Asia-Pacific region that the United States hasn't been doing in its own backyard for more than 200 years, since President Monroe in 1824 told European powers of the time that the Western Hemisphere was no longer any of their business and that the US would determine what happens in that region. And the US, of course, has quite a long record of seeking to engineer regime change, if I can call it that, in different Latin American countries over the last couple of hundred years, sometimes involving the direct use of US military forces, sometimes in more covert means. What all of this means is that there is an ongoing risk of heightened military and geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. That certainly doesn't mean that some kind of serious war is inevitable, and I don't think either country seriously believes that that's in their interests. But as we know from a moment's thought about how the First World War started, with a terrorist incident in Sarajevo, in what's today Bosnia-Herzegovina, major conflicts can sometimes start by accident if big countries with conflicting interests think that things are moving in an unstoppable direction. So that'll be an important area to watch as well. If you'd like to see the slides again, or to look at Wednesday's presentation, which mainly focused on the Australian economy, you'll be able to find that on the website over the weekend. You can also see how to subscribe to a weekly update of these and other charts and gain access to other material and talks that will only be available very soon to subscribers. Thank you for being here this afternoon. I hope you found these slides useful in the decisions that you may have to make about your business or your investments, or maybe they've just brought you up to speed with an important region of the world economy, whether it's where you live or one in which you take an ongoing interest. If there are any questions, I'd be delighted to do my best to attempt to answer them. But otherwise, can I again thank you for being here and look forward to engaging with you once again.